we've covered two trains that survived past the end of the private intercity passenger rail era, the Southern Crescent and the Rio Grande Zephyr. Both were long-distance luxury liners that were as much of an experience of a bygone grandeur as they were a form of transit. The last train in America takes place in a past that is still fairly recent in time, but is incredibly distant to our world today. The story actually barely even touches the world of the nationalization of passenger trains. Names like Amtrak won't even show up. Instead, it takes place during the slow decay of Georgia's rural regional rail system. The last train in America is the Georgia Railroad Bank's Super Mixed from Atlanta to Augusta, Georgia, carrying both freight and passengers on a slow shared journey until 1983. Okay, so the story of how a train carrying boxcars with passengers riding in the caboose lasted until 1983 is kind of complicated, and it involves some railroad business and regulation. The Georgia Railroad and Banking Company is our focus. It was founded in 1831 as the Georgia Railroad Company and was granted the rights to bank, and the company renamed itself accordingly to the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company shortly after. The company soon relieved itself of its railroading duties by leasing out its railroad. The lease would change hands a bunch of times until it more or less stabilized under ownership of the Atlantic Coastline Railroad. So just remember that the Georgia Railroad is a railroad being leased by another railroad from a bank, the Georgia Railroad Bank. It's confusing, but all this will help when we talk about why the trains ended. In the 1920s, the Georgia Railroad was providing pretty robust service between Atlanta and Augusta, Georgia, crossing the eastern half of central Georgia. It provided 4 daily trains between Atlanta and Augusta Union stations, with additional service on branches to Macon, Athens, and smaller Georgia towns, running anywhere from 1 to 4 times daily. In the late 1920s, some of the shortest branches closed, and others switched from passenger service to mixed trains that have passengers and freight, and during the Great Depression, it went into effect that all branches would be mixed service. By the 1940s, the Georgia Railroad had closed additional branches, and it was down to 2 daily passenger trains on its main line between Atlanta and Augusta, with branches all receiving mixed train service, usually daily or daily except Sunday. The 1960s were a bad time for trains across the country, and the Georgia Railroad was no exception. After 1967, the post office canceled its contracts to haul mail, and the economics of rural passenger service in Georgia began to really spiral. To deal with this loss, the Georgia Railroad turned to its last fast passenger service between Atlanta and Augusta and came up with a plan. It moved the trains out of Atlanta and Augusta's soon-to-be-demolished Union stations, and instead terminated trains at a small passenger and freight depot in Atlanta and at a freight yard in Augusta. And then, in 1969, the Georgia Railroad would opt to add up to 50 cars to its daily train between the two cities, and created what it called the Super Mixed. Okay, so at this point, you might be asking, why go through all the effort of strapping passengers onto the back of boxcars and not just abandon the routes like railroads across the country were doing? And that's a good question. So the answer is a mix of truth, and there's also some urban legend surrounding it. The root of it goes back to a provision added in the company's charter from 1831, that during the construction of the railroad, and for 7 years after, the company would not have to pay any taxes. and after that, a maximum taxation rate of 0.5% on their net earnings. The story is that this provision required the railroad to run passenger service in exchange for its tax status, but from what I've read, that wasn't true. The state challenged the railroad's tax status multiple times, and courts continuously ruled in favor of the railroad. Where I think the origin of the legend is that the original charter had stipulated that the Georgia Railroad would provide passenger and freight service, and the railroad believed that if it completely discontinued passenger services, the state would have legal standing that the company was no longer under its original charter. So they ran passenger service to avoid scrutiny that might lead to additional appeals, but the company also believed that running mixed passenger service was no more expensive than just having a caboose on the train, and often passengers simply did just ride in the caboose. With this arrangement in place, the establishment of Amtrak happened quietly in the background of the Georgia Railroad's mixed trains, trundling through central Georgia as they had for decades. The Georgia Railroad wasn't eligible to join Amtrak anyway. It operated entirely inside the state of Georgia, and so it wasn't under the regulation of the Interstate Commerce Commission. This brings me to an important point. The service sucked, and for more than a few reasons. First, it was one of the last racially segregated rail services in the country. The Supreme Court had overturned discriminatory practices that were allowed by the Interstate Commerce Commission starting in the 1940s. Southern states, in response, passed state-level laws upholding segregation, but since most trains traveled interstate, the effect was pretty limited. The Georgia Railroad, entirely in state, was regulated by the Georgia Public Service Commission, and it kept building segregated passenger cars into the 1950s.
This is what a segregated coach on the Georgia Railroad looked like. It's what's called a combine, which is a car that carries both passengers and freight, or passengers and their luggage. And usually a combine would be used on a small branch that didn't have enough traffic to support multiple passenger coaches and baggage cars. And the specific combine is what was called a Jim Crow combine. And a typical layout for a segregated Jim Crow combine would have two seating areas on opposite ends of the car with a baggage area in the center separating them. You can identify it pretty easily by the baggage door that's in the center, which sets it apart from an integrated combine where the baggage would be at the rear, or a regular passenger coach which does not have a baggage hold at all. Anyway, I don't know when these were finally integrated, but this segregated combine was built in 1952, several years after the Supreme Court outlawed segregation on railroads at a federal level. And similar cars show up as late as the 1980s, where they still have the partition that is separating the passenger areas.
The service itself was dismal. The coaches were decrepit. They were lit with kerosene and heated by stoves in the corner. There's an infamous sign that was on the coaches that told riders to stay seated to avoid slack action. Slack action is the distance that one train car can move before it begins pulling the next car. All trains have slack action, but passenger trains are normally less than a dozen cars long, so it's not really a big deal. But by the 70s, super mixed trains were hauling up to 200 freight cars, and so slack action could rapidly stop or start a freight car and shoot you out the back if you're standing up. The trip times were abysmal. The Atlanta to Augusta daily mixed train was scheduled for under 4 hours, but it would pick up and drop off freight along the way, extending travel times to 12 hours. On the branch to Athens, the track condition degraded so severely it was limited to 10 miles per hour for almost the entire route, which made it too long for crews to complete in one day, and it was abandoned in 1982. Trips were often canceled or ended halfway without any notice, and passengers would be put on taxis or buses for the rest of their trip. Finally, the trains ended in freight yards without any passenger amenities or connections. And now this brings me to one of my favorite parts of the story. In 1975, the Georgia Railroad moved its trains out of the passenger and freight depot in downtown Atlanta into a small office in a freight yard east of the downtown. 4 years later, in 1979, the MARTA Inman Park Reynolds-Town Station opened. So for a brief window in time, in a bizarre overlap of eras, you could ride a modern MARTA train to Inman Park, walk half a mile, and then get on a train with kerosene lanterns, hauling you and 200 freight cars on a slow trip through rural Georgia. All good things must come to an end, and a lot of shitty things come to an end as well, and the Georgia Railroad train was one of them. By the 1980s, annual ridership was under 1,000 passengers, and the bulk of those were school field trips. These low ridership numbers weren't actually even what got the train discontinued, though. So remember back to how I said that the Georgia Railroad was a railroad being leased by another railroad from its parent company, the Georgia Railroad Bank. The railroad leasing the Georgia Railroad was the Atlantic Coast Line, and in 1960, the Atlantic Coast Line and Seaboard Airline merged to form the Seaboard Coast Line. In the early 80s, the Seaboard Coast Line approached the Georgia Railroad Bank about purchasing the Georgia Railroad. The Georgia Railroad Bank had been out of the railroading business for around a century at that point, and they quickly agreed to the sale. After the sale in November 1982, the Seaboard Coast Line no longer owned the Georgia Railroad under its original charter, and the tax-exempt status was lost. A day after the sale was complete, the Seaboard Coast Line filed with the Georgia Public Service Commission to discontinue the mixed trains, and permission to do so was granted the next spring. 5 days after the Rio Grande Zephyr rolled for the final time, the remaining branches ran their final mixed trains. And a week later, on May 6, 1983, the super mixed train between Atlanta and Augusta ran for the final time, making it the last private intercity train in America. So that wraps it up. The final dozen years of private passenger rail and the trains that persisted past what was supposed to be the end. It's also possible that these weren't really the end, and there is some little known train that made it past this era. Like, even while researching, I found a privately operated commuter train in Pittsburgh that I'd never heard of that ran until 1985, and I found some kind of shadowy references to another mixed train in Michigan or maybe Wisconsin that lasted longer than the Georgia Railroad. Important to remember also is that despite the dramatic title, these weren't the true last trains. During this whole era, Amtrak was slowly getting its feet, and by the time the Georgia Railroad made its last run, Amtrak had already picked up 4 million more riders than its first year of service. Private rail isn't even gone forever. 35 years after our story ended, Brightline passenger rail service began operating out of Miami. If you enjoyed this series, you should go check out my other videos or follow me on Twitter at Big Mood Energy. You can also check out my Patreon, and thanks for watching.